occasionally come up to a brick wall. And so sometimes you just want to talk that out with somebody, and I'm more than happy to do that at any time. So you're more than welcome to call me. So part of what I do through Skulski Consulting is we put out a newsletter on accessibility management news. You're more than welcome to subscribe through the website, or you can send me an email. But I like to send out the top things that every accessibility coordinator should know out there. And it's little tidbits of information that they could pass on to their accessibility management team, just communication information, updates on the standards, on litigation. You know, I think this article that we just put out a couple of weeks ago, we forwarded on about why you should use a microphone in meetings is a really good example. There's a lot of times people will be talking along and say, oh, I don't need to use a microphone, do I? But then our job, we have to remember that there are people that might have hearing impairments, that use of the microphone is beneficial to everyone. And so we always just want to be out there working to make sure that we're advocating accessible programs, services, and activities. So that's just kind of a little tidbit from one of our last newsletters, but you're welcome to subscribe through the website or send me an email. Just as a little bit of a review, because I'm sure that all of you are kind of along in different points of your learning on the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I wanted to kind of clarify for everybody and make sure that you knew that if you're from a unit of state or local government, you're covered under Title II of the ADA, and there are certain administrative requirements that you were supposed to complete back between 1990 and up until about 1995. Those included designating a responsible employee. Sometimes we call that the accessibility coordinator. Sometimes it's in the CEO or executive director, or, you know, it even could be a deputy mayor or even the mayor. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But so designating a responsible employee, issuing a notice to the public about your intent to comply on the ADA, establishing a grievance procedure, conducting a self-evaluation, and conducting a transition plan. And all of these efforts, no matter if you're an entity with more than 50 employees or less than 50 employees, they all show your good faith effort in terms of complying with Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So say, for example, you are an entity with less than 50 employees, but you get a complaint to the Department of Justice because one of your facilities is not accessible. One of the first things the investigator is going to ask, even though you're not required to do it because you're smaller, is to say, you know, do you have an ADA transition plan? And so that in and of itself serves as a good faith effort to show that you understand that there barriers exist for people with disabilities and you have a plan for removal of those barriers. So even though a couple of these, like the designated responsible employee, the grievance procedure, and the transition plan, apply to larger entities with more than 50 employees, I always recommend that all organizations have completed all of the administrative requirements to show, in the event that you were to have a complaint, your good faith effort. So just out of curiosity, we have a little poll question for you, and I think that Jennifer already put that up to show, and basically we want to know in your organization, what's happening with your ADA self-evaluation and transition plan. And I think she added a D item there as well. Jennifer, I think, did you already might have asked that out there? Let me see the poll here and how people are, and we'll go back to that. So the question is, and I like to ask this in training and when I'm talking with folks out in the field, is your self-evaluation and transition plan, is it something that got done back in the early 1990s and it's just been put on the shelf? Is it collecting dust? Is it something that you've revisited? Did it ever even address parks and recreation facilities, programs, and services? You know, we have to remember that the actual accessibility standards for park and recreation facilities are new to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So before 2010, we didn't really know what it meant to have an accessible swimming pool or an accessible golf course. We had an idea of it, but not really what the accessibility standards actually looked like. You know, is it a dynamic working document? I've worked with entities that they did their transition plan way back when they were required to, and they revisit it every few years, and they recognize that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of barriers to access for people with disabilities, and that they need to include that in both their ongoing maintenance plan and their capital improvement plan. And so they've incorporated that as a dynamic working document. Or, and you shouldn't, you know, recognize that if you answer the last, that it doesn't exist at all, you're not alone. You know, I think the most important point is if you do answer it doesn't exist, that you know that it doesn't exist and that you recognize that it is a priority. I'm still surprised as we're coming up on the 29th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, how many public entities have yet to complete those administrative requirements. And so I think it's really important, you know, to know that it should be on your radar and what you need to do in terms of getting that, that completed. In Parks and Recreation, I like to talk to folks about, even though they might have completed their self-evaluation and transition plan back early in the 1990s, why is it important to address those administrative requirements now? And so I have a picture up on the screen there, and that's the iconic photo of Marilyn Monroe. And I'm going to ask you maybe in the chat room there, if you, if anybody knows what movie that iconic photo is from. And we'll see if anybody, and what that, well, somebody answered Some Like It Hot. That's a good guess, but that's not quite it. That really, for some of you, you're like, who's Marilyn Monroe? But for others, so you're going to have to go back through your recollection of Marilyn Monroe, but that iconic photo is from, that's right, Victoria, the 7-Year Itch. And what does that have in common with the Title II administrative requirements? Well, actually, each individual, the average time that they spend in a position is 7 years. So if you think about it, since the ADA was passed in 1990, and we're coming up on the 29th anniversary, we've had 3, almost 4 generations of folks responsible for ADA compliance in our organization come and go. And we've had other organizations where it's still been the same person this whole entire time. But it's a huge amount of information. So if you have an accessibility management team and, you know, 3 or 4 generations of folks have come through in that position, there's a lot of information that may or may not have been passed on. So I always recommend to public entities, even though they have completed their self-evaluation and transition plan, that it's a good idea to go back and revisit those every 7 to 10 years, especially because some changes might have been made to policies, practices, and procedures. Some might have been changed back. I've been working with an organization not too long ago that they had a couple of people that went through, made modifications to policies, practices, and procedures to make sure they were compliant with the ADA, and then a new group of folks came into those different roles, and those modifications got changed back to the original policy that screened out people with disabilities. So it's important to recognize that there is a lot of times that we lose historical information because folks leave, and it's a good practice for us to go back and revisit our policies, practices, and procedures in our transition plan. And Jennifer just posted the poll results there, and it's not surprising to me that 45% of you or 46% of you would say that it doesn't exist. But what I would definitely recommend that if it doesn't exist, that you're taking copious notes here, and that we talk down the road about how we can get that back on the radar for your entity, because it does serve as your first line of defense if you had any type of complaint or private right of action filed against you under the Americans with Disabilities Act.